Imagine the scene. It is early 2002. In a remote mountain valley in eastern Afghanistan, the most powerful military on Earth is preparing what it believes will be a decisive operation. This army has everything: satellites watching from orbit, special forces on the ground, fighter jets in the sky, unmatched logistics, a global intelligence network. It is, by every measurable standard, the most technologically advanced force in human history. And yet, it enters a valley, believing it will face 200 enemy fighters. In reality, there are nearly 1,000. That single miscalculation will nearly collapse the entire operation. Welcome to Critical Decisions. Here, we don't just tell the story of wars. We analyze the human decisions that shape them. By the end of this episode, you will understand how even overwhelming military power can be neutralized by a single flawed assumption. To understand how this happened, we need to go back a few months. In late 2001, after the fall of the Taliban regime, many in Washington believed the war in Afghanistan was almost over. Al-Qaeda had been hit hard. The Taliban government had collapsed. Major cities were in coalition hands. But Al-Qaeda did not disappear. It did what insurgent organizations always do when they are under pressure. It scattered, it hid, it regrouped. One of those regroupings formed in a valley called Shah-i-Kot in Paktia province, in eastern Afghanistan. This valley was no ordinary piece of terrain. It was long and narrow, surrounded by steep mountains rising well above 3,000 meters. Only a few narrow routes led in or out. It was a natural fortress, a perfect place to hide, a perfect place to fight, and a terrible place to attack. For American planners, Shah-i-Kot looked like an opportunity. If they could surround that valley, they could destroy one of the last major concentrations of Al-Qaeda fighters in Afghanistan. One decisive blow. One clean operation. That idea became Operation Anaconda. The plan was elegant. Too elegant. It was based on a maneuver as old as warfare itself: the hammer and the anvil. The hammer would be made of Afghan allied forces. They would advance through the valley from the west. The anvil would be American troops. They would be flown by helicopter onto the eastern ridgelines, blocking all escape routes. Caught between the two, the enemy would be crushed. On paper, it was perfect, but all of this depended on one critical factor: intelligence. How many enemy fighters were actually in the valley? U.S. intelligence assessments said there were 100 to 250 men who were tired, poorly equipped, demoralized after months of pressure and defeat. Based on that estimate, commanders made a crucial decision. They deployed light infantry forces. No heavy artillery, no large armored units, minimal air support, planned only as a backup. From a human perspective, it made sense. Why bring overwhelming firepower against an enemy believed to be weak? This is where war becomes dangerous. Because humans do not plan against reality. They plan against what they believe reality to be, and sometimes, what they believe is wrong. At dawn on March 2, 2002, U.S. helicopters entered the Shah-i-Kot Valley, and within minutes, the illusion collapsed. There were not 200 fighters. There were 700, 800, perhaps 1,000. They were not scattered. They were not weak. They were not surprised. They were dug in. They had prepared fighting positions. They controlled the high ground. They had mortar, heavy machine guns, and rocket-propelled grenades. The landing zones had already been measured, targeted, pre-registered for fire. The helicopters landed directly inside kill zones. In seconds, what was supposed to be a clean insertion became a desperate fight for survival. And then, the plan began to unravel even further. The moment the first helicopters touched down in Shah-i-Kot, the reality of the battlefield became brutally clear. American soldiers were landing into a storm of fire. Mortars were already falling. Machine guns were already sweeping the ridgelines. This was not a weak, scattered enemy. This was a prepared defense. And then, the second pillar of the plan collapsed. The Afghan hammer was supposed to push the enemy forward into the American anvil. But Afghan forces were not equipped or trained for this kind of fight. They came under intense enemy fire almost immediately. And then something even worse happened. SCAC, Ultra Zero gunship, flying overhead, misidentified their position. Friendly fire struck the Afghan troops, confused, demoralized, and suddenly under fire from both sides. The Afghan units broke. They retreated. The hammer was gone. With the hammer gone, the entire concept of the operation collapsed. The enemy was no longer being pushed forward. Instead, Al-Qaeda fighters turned their full attention to the American troops on the ridgelines. The anvil was now alone. This was the moment the battle truly became dangerous. Small groups of U.S. soldiers were now holding isolated mountain positions, outnumbered and surrounded. They had no heavy artillery. They had limited air support, and they were fighting uphill against an enemy that had prepared for this fight for weeks. This was no longer a planned operation. It was survival. Commanders quickly realized that their original assumptions were wrong. They had believed the enemy would be weak. They had believed resistance would collapse. They had believed speed and surprise would win the day. None of that was happening. Instead, U.S. forces were being pinned down by well-coordinated enemy fire. Mortars rained down on landing zones. Machine guns covered the ridges. Any movement was punished. This is what military planners call friction. The difference between how a war is supposed to unfold and how it actually does. As the situation worsened, commanders faced a terrible choice. They could pull back and abandon the operation, or they could double down and try to regain control in the middle of chaos. They chose to push forward, and that decision led directly to one of the most intense firefights of the entire war, a mountain called Takurgar. High above the valley floor, Takurgar dominated the terrain. Whoever controlled it could see everything. Enemy positions, American movements, the flow of the battle. To regain situational awareness, U.S. commanders decided to place a small reconnaissance team on the summit. The intelligence imagery said the summit was clear. It was wrong. As the helicopter Razor 03 approached the peak, it was suddenly hit by a barrage of enemy fire. Rocket-propelled grenades, machine guns. The aircraft was damaged. In the chaos, one man fell from the ramp. Navy SEAL Neil Roberts. He landed alone in deep snow, behind enemy lines, on one of the most heavily defended pieces of ground in the valley. This single moment turned a failing operation into a desperate rescue mission. U.S. forces now faced an impossible dilemma. They could leave him, or they could fight their way onto a mountain controlled by hundreds of enemy fighters. They chose to go back, and what followed would become known as the Battle of Takurgar. For the next 17 hours, American soldiers fought for control of that summit. Helicopters were shot at as they tried to land. Troops were pinned down by fire from multiple directions. Every meter of ground was contested. Among them was Sergeant John Chapman. Badly wounded, he realized his teammates were about to be overrun, so he did something almost unthinkable. He charged the enemy positions alone. He destroyed multiple machine gun nests. He continued to fight even after being hit again. He fought until he could no longer move, and he died protecting the others. By the time the fighting ended, 7 American soldiers had lost their lives on that mountain. All of it because the summit had been wrongly believed to be empty. One faulty piece of intelligence. One fatal assumption. At this point, Operation Anaconda was on the edge of disaster. The ground forces were exhausted. The enemy still held strong positions, and the original plan was in ruins. Only one option remained. At this point, Operation Anaconda was no longer going according to plan. It was barely holding together. Ground forces were pinned down. Casualties were mounting. Enemy fighters still controlled key terrain. And yet, the operation did not collapse. Because modern warfare has one last card. Air power. U.S. commanders made a critical decision. They shifted from a ground-centric plan to an air-dominated campaign. A 10 Thunderbolts, AC-130 gunships, attack helicopters. All were brought in at full force. For days, the valley was struck continuously. Day and night, mortar positions, bunkers, ridgelines, all were targeted. Up to 65 airstrikes per day pounded enemy positions. Slowly, the balance began to change. Enemy fire weakened. American units could move again. Landing zones became usable. One by one, the high ground was taken back. The coalition regained control of Shah-i-Kot. Operation Anaconda survived, but not because the original plan was brilliant. It survived because the plan was abandoned. The commanders recognized that their assumptions were wrong. They adapted, they shifted, they corrected. That is the real lesson of this battle. From the outside, Anaconda looks like a story of firepower. But at its core, it is a story about human judgment. The first mistake was not tactical. It was psychological. Leaders trusted numbers that confirmed what they wanted to believe. They underestimated their enemy. They overestimated their own control. That bias nearly cost them the entire operation. And this is not unique to war. The same pattern appears in business. In politics, in crisis management, leaders build plans around assumptions. And when those assumptions are wrong, everything built on top of them collapses. The difference between disaster and survival is not technology. It is the ability to recognize a mistake and change before it is too late. Operation Anaconda was not saved by superior weapons. It was saved by adaptation, by commanders who finally accepted that the battlefield was not what they had expected. Modern wars are not won by firepower alone. They are won, or lost, by decisions. We don't analyze wars. We analyze the decisions that shape them. Welcome to Critical Decisions.